The air hung thick with a suffocating blend of old money and polished arrogance. Stepping across the threshold of Blackwood Manor felt like entering another dimension, a place where the very floorboards whispered tales of generations born to unimaginable privilege. For Sarah, a newcomer from a world measured in practicalities and earned pennies, the sheer scale of wealth was a physical blow. It wasn't just the sprawling grounds that seemed to swallow the horizon whole, or the facade that loomed like a fortress against the sky, but the cold, heavy opulence that hit her the moment the massive oak doors swung shut behind her. It was a world designed to make anyone outside its gilded cage feel small, insignificant, utterly invisible. This wasn't just a job. It felt like a test, a challenge thrown down by the very stones of the house, daring her to find her footing, daring her to matter in a place where she was clearly not meant to belong. Facing down systems of power that seek to erase you, facing down the crushing weight of feeling unseen, that's a fight many know. But finding the strength to rise, to reclaim your presence, that's the story worth telling. If you believe in the power of resilience and the quiet pursuit of justice against overwhelming odds, then show your support. Like this video and subscribe to join us in uncovering more stories of those who dared to challenge the script. She stood in the vast foyer, a speck of dust against a canvas of marble and mahogany. The silence here wasn't empty. It was weighted, filled with the unseen presence of those who dwelled within these walls. A silence that seemed to judge her worn, sensible shoes against the gleaming perfection of the floor. Her new uniform, crisp but unfamiliar, felt like a costume she hadn't earned the right to wear. The scent of lemon polish and aged leather pricked her nostrils, a scent that spoke of tireless upkeep and standards she couldn't yet grasp. Every shadow seemed longer, every echo louder in the cavernous space. A grandfather clock, tall as a man, ticked with a rhythm that felt ancient and unforgiving. She imagined the lives lived here, detached and distant, viewing the world and its workers from an untouchable height. It was more than just intimidation. It was a palpable sense of being alien. Her own quiet footsteps on the polished stone felt clumsy and loud, an intrusion in this hushed world. She felt her shoulders tense, her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't just a place of work. It was a landscape of social inequality made physical, a constant, silent reminder that she was merely a temporary fixture, easily replaced, barely seen. The vastness of the house mirrored the vastness of the divide between her world and theirs, a divide that felt insurmountable, a chasm she had just willingly stepped into. The weight of it settled upon her, heavy and cold. The pre-dawn chill clung to the flagstone floors, a constant, biting companion. Her hands, raw and chapped despite the heavy aprons, moved with a weary rhythm, polishing the gleaming brass stair rods until her reflection shimmered back distortedly. Every day began the same way, the faint, mournful clang of the distant stable clock, signaling the start of a grueling, thankless shift. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom of the servants' corridor, illuminating the relentless, unending nature of the work. Every surface had to gleam, every corner be free of even the faintest trace of neglect. There were rules, a tangled web of unspoken expectations and harsh, explicit commands. Staff were to be invisible, silent phantoms gliding through the grand house. Their voices, when permitted at all, must be muted, subservient. To meet a resident's gaze directly was an act of impudence, punishable by sharp reprimands or worse. They ate their meager meals in the cramped, stuffy kitchen, a world away from the lavish dining room above. Their paths were carefully orchestrated to avoid crossing those of their employers, a stark physical manifestation of the chasm between above and below. The air up there smelled of expensive perfumes and roasted meats. Down here, it was beeswax, damp stone, and the ever-present faint odor of lye soap. Most residents drifted through their opulent lives with a profound, almost artistic indifference to the humans who facilitated their comfort. There was the matriarch, Lady Ashworth, a woman whose steely gaze could wither a rose at 50 paces. She rarely spoke to the staff, preferring to communicate through sharp glances or curt nods to her lady's maid. Her son, Lord Thomas, was equally detached, his mind seemingly perpetually occupied with hunting or political matters, never sparing a glance for the faces he passed in the hallway. On the rare occasion one of them acknowledged a servant, it was usually to deliver a complaint, a cutting word about a perceived imperfection. She remembered polishing the silver in the dining room one afternoon when Lord Thomas swept in, his boots echoing on the polished floor. He hadn't even looked at her, merely gesturing towards a faint smudge on a candelabra.
This is unacceptable. Are your eyes not working, girl?
He'd snapped, his voice cold and dismissive, before turning on his heel and leaving her trembling slightly, her heart pounding against her ribs. It wasn't just her. Every member of the staff felt the weight of that casual contempt, the constant reminder of their lowliness in the grand, uncaring hierarchy of the house. This was their reality, a life lived in the shadows, invisible and disposable in the eyes of those they served. The polished marble floor gleamed under the soft light of the grand foyer. Sarah, her hands busy with a dusting cloth, moved with quiet efficiency. Her blue uniform, clean but simple, felt less like clothing and more like a visible barrier between her and the vibrant world of the people who lived and gathered here. Guests swept past her, their laughter echoing like distant chimes, their eyes seeming to look right through her, or worse, past her, as if she were simply another inanimate object in the opulent surroundings. A tangible chill settled over her shoulders, not from the temperature of the vast hall, but from the pervasive sense of being invisible, non-existent in their elevated sphere. These were the first cold shoulders, delivered not with harsh words, but with the subtle, profound dismissal of her personhood. Small moments, sharp and frequent, etched themselves into her memory. A hand pulling away swiftly if it brushed hers in passing, accompanied by a faint sound of distaste. A sudden silence falling over a lively conversation as she approached a nearby table, only for it to resume the moment she was safely out of earshot. Louder this time, perhaps intentionally. It wasn't overt cruelty yet, not the sharp jab of a direct insult, but a pervasive, chilling sense of being less than, of belonging to a category unworthy of notice or respect. It was the silent treatment of the privileged towards the help, a subtle, constant reminder of her place. She knelt by a large potted palm near a set of plush velvet chairs, meticulously wiping down its broad, glossy leaves, trying to lose herself in the repetitive motion. Nearby, two figures stood, a man and a woman, both impeccably dressed, their conversation flowing with easy confidence. They were utterly oblivious to her presence, or perhaps simply unconcerned, their voices carrying clearly in the vast space. They were discussing staffing, the help, their words laced with effortless contempt, a casual cruelty that chilled Sarah far more than any silent treatment.
Honestly, hiring these days is such a gamble. You never know what you're getting.
His voice was resonant, dismissive.
Exactly. And the expectations? They want decent wages, benefits, as if dusting and scrubbing requires a degree.
Her tone was sharp, laced with incredulity.
Right? Basic instruction is all it takes. And you still get some who just can't grasp the simplest tasks. Utterly useless.
He laughed, a short, dry sound.
Or they steal. You always have to keep an eye out. It's just easier to assume they're not quite capable or trustworthy. You know, their sort.
The final words, dripping with insinuation, landed like stones. Sarah's hands paused, the dusting cloth suddenly feeling heavy, damp with her sudden perspiration. The air grew thick around her, suffocating. Each word struck her like a physical blow, not because they were directed at her specifically, but because they were directed about her, about them, about people like her, defined solely by their uniform, reduced to stereotypes of incompetence, greed, and low intelligence. She wasn't Sarah, who dreamt of opening her own small business, who read books late into the night, who cared deeply for her family and sacrificed daily for their future. She was the help, easily dismissed, inherently suspect, reduced to a label and a set of negative assumptions. The polished floor seemed to blur through the sudden moisture that welled in her eyes. Hot and stinging, a bitter taste filled her mouth, the taste of indignity, of being fundamentally misunderstood and undervalued based on appearance and circumstance alone. A profound hurt settled deep within her chest. This wasn't just a job. It was a constant negotiation of her own worth in the face of casual, cutting prejudice. The first seeds of internal conflict had been sown, whispering questions about who she was in their eyes and how she could possibly endure being seen this way without losing herself entirely. The atmosphere, already thick with unspoken tension, curdled further. The dismissive glances evolved into pointed stares, the hushed whispers into outright comments, delivered just loud enough to pierce the air. It was no longer merely being overlooked. Now, she was undeniably the target. A knot tightened in her stomach every morning, anticipating the day's fresh onslaught. The scent of stale coffee and manufactured pleasantness in the office now carried a distinct tang of malice, a corrosive element that seemed to eat away at her confidence. One afternoon, presenting findings she had pored over for weeks, the male bully leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips.
Interesting. Assumptions, wouldn't you say? Some of us rely on actual data, not just, gut feelings or creative interpretations.
The words hung heavy, laced with disdain, a thinly veiled jab at her process and intelligence. He didn't raise his voice, yet the sound scraped like sandpaper against her spirit. Another time, discussing a proposed solution, the female bully scoffed audibly from across the table.
Oh, bless her heart. She thinks that'll work? That's adorable. Like watching a toddler try to build a skyscraper with building blocks.
The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow. It wasn't just the content. It was the deliberate cruelty in their eyes, the calculated enjoyment of her discomfort. They began picking apart her background, references made to her upbringing or education that felt designed to highlight perceived deficiencies.
Did they even teach that course where you went? Must have been skipping class.
Or then,
Some people just aren't built for this kind of environment, are they? Too sensitive, perhaps. Can't handle a little friendly critique?
The term friendly critique was the cruelest disguise of all, a backhanded compliment that twisted the knife deeper, implying her struggles were a personal failing, not a reaction to their relentless torment. She felt the weight of their gaze constantly. Every email she sent, every presentation she gave, every suggestion she offered seemed to be dissected, not for its merit, but for flaws to exploit. It was like living under a microscope, magnified and judged for every perceived imperfection. The vibrant colors of her passion began to fade, replaced by a muted gray under the relentless rain of disrespect. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed, acutely aware that someone, somewhere, was likely waiting to pounce on a typo or an awkward phrase. The once crisp air of possibility now tasted metallic with fear and resentment. This wasn't just workplace stress. It was an emotional siege, escalating with every passing day. A cold knot tightened in her stomach whenever the familiar condescending tone pierced the air. It wasn't just words anymore. It was a physical assault, a constant, dull ache behind her eyes that persisted long after the interactions ended. She felt herself shrinking, physically trying to occupy less space, hoping to become invisible in the sterile, unforgiving office environment. The air itself seemed to carry the scent of stale coffee and unspoken judgment. Thick and suffocating. Each day was a negotiation between the gnawing need to pay rent, to simply survive, and the desperate urge to snatch back the shards of her dignity scattered across the cold, tiled floor. There were moments, sudden and intense, when the feeling of smallness overwhelmed everything else. A carelessly dismissive comment, a laugh shared at her expense that echoed like a slap in the quiet office. The deliberate exclusion from a project or conversation. These were not just minor annoyances. They were calculated strikes. In those instances, the desire to stand up, to scream, to simply walk out and never return burned so fiercely it left a bitter taste in her mouth, like ash. She would grip her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white, the urge to flee, a powerful, physical tremor running through her hands. The thought of the quiet freedom outside, the simple dignity of choosing her own path, was a siren song. But then, the harsh reality would crash down. The bills weren't going to pay themselves. The empty refrigerator wouldn't magically fill. The determination, a stubborn ember flickering in the deepest part of her spirit, would push back against the despair. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She wouldn't let them define her worth. It wasn't just about survival. It morphed into a quiet, internal war, a silent promise to herself that she would not be defeated by their cruelty. She would outlast them, outwork them, perhaps even one day rise above them. Unknown to her tormentors, there was a secret garden in her soul, a vibrant, thriving space untouched by their scorn. It was her hidden passion, a talent she nurtured in the quiet hours away from their gaze. It was something beautiful and complex, requiring skill and imagination, offering a sense of accomplishment they could never take away. This secret pride, this quiet escape, was the wellspring from which her determination flowed. It was proof, undeniable and internal, that their small-minded view of her was wrong. They saw only what they wanted to see. She knew the depth and potential they were blind to, and in that knowledge, she found the strength to feel small, yet dream impossibly big. A buzz, low at first, like the murmur of a distant storm, began to ripple through the grand halls of the mansion. It wasn't the usual hum of daily upkeep, but something charged with anticipation, a nervous energy that vibrated through the very foundations. An announcement had been made. The master was hosting a gathering. Not a casual dinner, but a major event, a sophisticated salon, a cultural assembly of note, destined to fill every opulent room with the city's elite. The air thickened with expectation. Every surface gleamed, polished to mirror perfection, until one could see their own anxious reflection. The scent of lemon polish mingled with the fainter, sweeter perfume of lilies flown in especially for the occasion. Rolls of rich velvet and silk were unspooled, transforming tired corners into vibrant displays. In the kitchens, a flurry of activity commenced, the clatter of pots and pans a frantic symphony as chefs planned elaborate menus, their voices sharp with urgency. The humid heat from the ovens seeped into the surrounding corridors, a palpable sign of the culinary spectacle being prepared. Staff scurried like startled mice, their movements precise yet hurried, each step dictated by an unseen clock ticking down to the momentous night. Chandeliers were painstakingly cleaned, each crystal droplet catching and refracting the light like 1,000 tiny eyes watching their progress. The gardens received meticulous attention, their manicured perfection a silent testament to the wealth and status on display. Every detail, down to the placement of a single cushion or the fold of a napkin, was scrutinized under the harsh light of impending judgment. But beneath the veneer of perfection lay a heightened tension, a silent mandate that weighed heavily on every shoulder. For the staff, this event wasn't just work. It was an exercise in invisibility. The master's expectation, unspoken but absolute, was that they would blend into the very wallpaper. Unseen, unheard, their presence only registered in the seamless efficiency of the evening. More than ever before, they were required to be phantoms, ghosts serving the living, their own struggles and identities to be utterly erased for the duration of the party. This requirement amplified the pressure, adding another layer of vulnerability to those already living on the margins. The grand gathering, meant to celebrate culture and society, became a crucible for the staff, a stage upon which the deep, stark divide between those seen and those deliberately overlooked would be thrown into sharp, unforgiving relief. It was the perfect setting, this house of mirrors and secrets, for the conflict brewing beneath its polished surface to finally, dramatically erupt. The air in the main hall buzzed with anticipation, a symphony of nervous chatter, the clinking of cutlery being set, and the distant melody of a string quartet tuning. A faint scent of polished wood and expensive perfume hung heavy, a stark contrast to the nervous knot tightening in Maria's stomach. She smoothed down the unfamiliar fabric of her dress, feeling every seam like a judgment. People drifted past, their laughter easy, their movements fluid, belonging. She felt clumsy, out of place, a piece of driftwood in a formal garden. Then the whispers started. Not quite whispers, but deliberately audible comments, cutting through the polite background noise like shards of glass. Leading the charge was Mr. Henderson, his smile wide and fake, flanked by Mrs. Albright, whose eyes held a cruel amusement. They paused near where Maria was attempting to discreetly find her assigned seat. Mr. Henderson gestured subtly towards her, loud enough for several tables nearby to hear.
Ah, look who's arrived. Our little cultural anomaly. Still trying to figure out which fork is which, dear.
Mrs. Albright chimed in, her voice dripping with mock concern.
Oh, Robert, don't be so harsh. Perhaps she hasn't had the opportunity to acquire such refined tastes. Though one does wonder how she even knows which end of a spoon goes into her mouth.
A wave of stifled giggles rippled across a nearby table. Maria's cheeks burned hotter than any fire. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving a cold, clammy film on her skin. It wasn't just the words, crude and insulting, but the public nature of it, the casual dismissal of her humanity, her worth, reduced to a caricature of ignorance. It felt like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. The smell of expensive perfume suddenly felt suffocating. The gentle music, a mocking serenade to her humiliation. She wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear. Her hands trembled, and she gripped the back of a chair for support. This wasn't just mild teasing. This was a calculated, public dismantling of her confidence, designed to belittle her before everyone, to remind her exactly where they thought she belonged or didn't belong. The comments weren't merely about skills with cutlery. They were barbed assaults on her background, her very identity, framing her as inherently incapable, uncultured, unworthy of being present. For a moment, a crushing weight of despair settled upon her, threatening to buckle her knees. She saw the pitying glances, the smirks, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact from those who didn't want to be associated with her public shaming. It was the lowest point she had ever felt in such a grand setting. But as the heat of shame subsided, replaced by a chilling resolve, something shifted within her. A quiet storm began to gather behind her eyes. The breaking point wasn't yielding to despair. It was the sudden, searing realization that she couldn't let this stand. Not anymore. The mockery had stripped away the last vestiges of her fear, leaving behind a raw, powerful surge of determination. She wouldn't be their punchline. Not tonight. The familiar cold hand of anxiety tightened around her chest, a sensation she knew intimately, like the worn fabric of an old coat. It was the perpetual companion of invisibility, the quiet enforcer of her self-imposed silence. For years, she had carried this weight, the ingrained conditioning whispering that safety lay in the shadows, that talent was a target, and visibility a vulnerability she couldn't afford. Stay low, stay quiet, stay out of the way. The mantra had been hammered into her consciousness by a lifetime of subtle slights and overt dismissals. She felt the stale, recycled air of the office building on her skin, heavy with the scent of lukewarm coffee and forgotten lunches, a physical manifestation of the stagnant routine that trapped her. She heard the distant murmur of voices, the casual laughter that sometimes carried a sharp, cutting edge she recognized instantly. Each sound, each scent, each sensation was a tiny, invisible brick added to the wall of her fear, reinforcing the idea that staying hidden was the only way to survive here. They saw her, yes, but they didn't see her. She was furniture, a quiet shadow, a background detail in their bustling, self-important lives. But something was shifting beneath the surface of that quiet compliance. The cumulative weight of the disrespect wasn't just pressing her down. It was compressing a dangerous fuel within her. The casual disregard, the assumptions of incompetence, the way her ideas were overlooked only to be celebrated when voiced by another. Each instance was a spark. They flickered and died for a long time, tiny embers of resentment. But now, the oxygen of her growing frustration was fanning them into a roaring fire. She remembered the way he'd waved her away last week, not even bothering to look her in the eye.
Just handle the paperwork, will you? Leave the real thinking to...
He hadn't even finished the sentence. the implication hanging heavy in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. She recalled the snickering comments after a particularly brutal meeting, the way she'd shrunk into her chair, wishing the floor would swallow her whole.
Honestly, some people just don't have it, do they? Bless her heart.
The saccharine pity had stung worse than outright malice. A powerful surge of defiance, hot and electric, coursed through her veins, shocking her system like a jolt of pure adrenaline. It tasted like copper and felt like breaking chains. The fear was still there, a knot in her stomach, but it was suddenly smaller, drowned out by the roar of a new, terrifying resolve. The silence hadn't protected her. It had only made her an easier target. Being invisible hadn't brought peace. It had only ensured she was continually overlooked and undervalued. Enough. The word echoed in the suddenly quiet chambers of her mind. A simple declaration loaded with the weight of years of suppression. Enough shrinking. Enough hiding. Enough letting them define her worth by their limited, biased vision. This wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. It was about reclaiming herself. In that single breathtaking moment, standing there amidst the indifferent hum of the office, she made the decision. They had refused to see her in the shadows. Now, she would step into the light and make them see. She would reveal the talent she had so fiercely guarded, not for their validation, but for her own liberation. The time for staying silent was over. A hush fell over the crowded courtyard, thick and heavy as the humid summer air. It was the kind of silence that wasn't expectant with hope, but brittle with mockery, ready to shatter into laughter at the slightest stumble. They watched, a collective mass of faces, some merely curious, others openly scornful, as she took a shaky breath and stepped forward. Disbelief rippled through the assembly like a wave. They squinted, tilting their heads as if unsure their eyes weren't deceiving them. This wasn't happening. She wasn't doing this. Confusion knitted brows, giving way to a flicker of amusement in the eyes of those who found her plight perpetually entertaining. Near the back, where the shadows clung longest, a knot of familiar faces exchanged knowing glances. A low chuckle rumbled from one, quickly echoed by another. This was better than they could have hoped for. A public humiliation delivered by the victim herself.
Look at her, thinking she's something. Bless her heart.
The words, though quiet, carried just enough malice to sting, just enough feigned pity to be cruel. A woman beside him leaned in, a smirk playing on her lips.
Oh, this is rich. What, is she gonna juggle rocks? Sing off key?
Her voice was laced with acid, designed to chip away at any sliver of courage she might possess. The protagonist felt the weight of their gazes, each stare a physical pressure against her skin. The air tasted stale, thick with skepticism. She could practically smell the doubt hanging over them, heavier than the usual odors of sweat and dust. Her hands, damp with nervous perspiration, clenched at her sides. Every muscle screamed for her to retreat, to melt back into the anonymity they had so readily assigned her. But she held her ground. The space in front of her felt vast. An empty arena where her hopes were about to be laid bare. The scoffing grew louder now, bolder as the crowd sensed her vulnerability. They weren't just skeptical. They were actively rooting for her failure. They wanted to see her fall, to confirm everything they already believed about her worthlessness. The tension was a tight coil in her stomach, winding tighter with each derisive snicker, each muttered doubt. Yet beneath the fear, a tiny ember glowed, the fierce, quiet determination of someone who had nothing left to lose but their dignity, and who was finally ready to fight for even that fragile thing. She lifted her chin, the noise of their disbelief fading slightly as she focused, preparing to step onto the stage that was set, not for triumph, but for her final public test. She stood before them, a figure dwarfed by the moment, the air thick with unspoken ridicule. The room buzzed with low murmurs and suppressed snickers. A symphony of doubt played just for her. They had set the stage for her humiliation, expecting a clumsy failure, a confirmation of their cruel judgments. But something in her posture had shifted. The tremor in her hands was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. She took a deep breath, the scent of stale coffee and mocking anticipation filling her lungs. Then she began. The first note wasn't timid. It was a clear, resonant sound that cut through the noise like a laser. It wasn't just a note. It was a statement, a purity of tone that defied the grimy atmosphere of the room, a ripple of unexpected beauty in a stagnant pool of negativity. It was the kind of sound that silenced chatter, that demanded attention without asking. Immediately, the scattered conversations faltered, then died. The rustling of clothes, the shuffling of feet, all ceased. A heavy stillness descended, broken only by the unfolding wonder she was creating. The air seemed to grow lighter, vibrating with the unexpected melody. Across the room, faces that moments before were contorted in sneers and smirks began to smooth out. Mark, the loudest mocker, felt a sudden chill run down his spine, entirely unrelated to the room's temperature. His jaw, set moments ago in smug derision, slackened slightly. Beside him, Sarah, whose eyes had gleamed with malicious anticipation, blinked slowly, her carefully constructed expression of disdain dissolving like mist in the morning sun.
What? What is that?
Sort of bewilderment. It wasn't the awkward fumbling sound they had predicted. It was good, unsettlingly good. Then came the intrigue. Their eyebrows, initially arched in mockery, knitted together in a reluctant frown of concentration. They leaned forward almost imperceptibly, drawn in despite themselves. The sound wove its spell, a tapestry of unexpected skill. Each note was a brushstroke, painting over their preconceived notions, challenging the narrative they had so gleefully crafted. The smugness was fully replaced by a hesitant curiosity, tinged with a dawning unease. This wasn't just an underdog attempting something foolish. This was something real, something powerful, emerging from the very person they had deemed insignificant. The room watched, collectively holding its breath, caught in the sudden, stunning reality of her hidden talent beginning to bloom. The notes danced from her fingers, not hesitant or clumsy as they had expected, but bold and precise, weaving a melody both intricate and deeply resonant. The air in the opulent dining room seemed to thicken, the clinking of silverware fading into a distant hum, then into nothing at all. Her eyes were closed, a quiet intensity etched upon her face, a stark contrast to the deferential expression they were accustomed to seeing. It wasn't just skill. It was a raw, unfiltered outpouring of emotion that flowed through the music, touching something deep within the listeners they hadn't known was there. Each note struck with a clarity that defied the simple circumstances of her presence. It was the sound of a soul, finally given voice, soaring above the whispers and dismissals that had tried to keep it bound. The delicate scent of expensive perfume and the rich aroma of the catered meal faded into the background, replaced by the invisible current of passion emanating from the grand piano. Heads began to turn. Conversations died on lips. Mrs. Albright, whose initial request had been laced with condescending amusement, now sat utterly still, her usually sharp features softened by sheer astonishment. Mr. Davies, the man who had joked about her little show, found his grin dissolving, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. A palpable silence fell over the room, broken only by the cascading notes and the occasional, involuntary sharp intake of breath from someone in the audience. It was the silence of people who had come for background noise and found themselves facing something profound, something that demanded their full, unwavering attention. They saw not the help fulfilling a menial task, but an artist revealing a hidden world of complexity and feeling. The realization spread like a quiet tide. This performance was not a novelty, not a simple amusement. It was a powerful, unexpected display of talent that was challenging their preconceived notions, leaving them breathless and utterly captivated. They were witnessing something extraordinary, something they had never expected, certainly not from her. And then, silence. A hush fell over the auditorium, thick and heavy, the kind that precedes either profound disappointment or breathtaking wonder. She stood center stage, bathed in a single blinding spotlight, her chest still heaving slightly from the final note. For so long, she had felt like a shadow, a whisper lost in the wind, unseen and unheard. Now the light clung to her, demanding attention, demanding presence. Her performance had been a whirlwind of unleashed emotion. Every suppressed tear, every swallowed insult, every moment of agonizing invisibility had been poured into the raw power of her voice, the intricate steps of her dance, or the searing honesty of her words. The very medium she had been told was worthless. Talent, she was told, didn't matter. The technical prowess was undeniable. Years of quiet, determined practice shone through every perfectly executed phrase, every controlled breath, every sharp, intentional movement. But here was the message that truly struck the audience like a physical blow. It spoke of resilience forged in fire, of dignity stripped but reclaimed, of a spirit that refused to break despite relentless pressure. They sat, stunned, on the edge of their seats. Faces in the crowd, moments before filled with polite expectation or bored indifference, were now etched with disbelief, awe, and in some corners, a dawning shame. A tear tracked down one woman's cheek. A man beside her, slowly, almost unconsciously, began to stand. The air crackled with an energy that transcended mere entertainment. It felt like witnessing a moment of profound truth being unveiled. The polished facade of the showcase had been cracked wide open by something raw, authentic, and deeply human. Across the front row, the expressions of those who had dismissed her, who had tried to silence her, shifted from smug anticipation to startled horror, then to poorly concealed fury. Their carefully constructed world of casual cruelty felt threatened by the sheer, undeniable force of her talent and the powerful resonance of her story, told not just with skill, but with the very fiber of her being. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she didn't see pity or scorn in their eyes. She saw impact. She saw the undeniable reality of what she had created, hanging in the charged air. A deep, vibrating sense of power settled within her. Not the fleeting arrogance of dominance, but the quiet, unbreakable strength of someone who had faced their deepest fears and found their voice. After the long darkness, the light felt not just warm, but like her rightful place. The silence stretched, pregnant with the weight of her performance, the weight of her journey from the shadows to this single, breathtaking peak. The applause was coming. She could feel it building like a distant wave. But in this suspended moment, her presence alone was the deafening climax. Then it ended, not with a flourish or a final crashing chord, but simply stopped. The last note, resonant and clear, hung in the air for a fraction of a second before dissolving into an abyss of absolute quiet. A silence so profound it felt heavier than sound. Across the hall, a dropped pin would have echoed like thunder. Time itself seemed to hold its breath, suspended in that fragile, stunned moment. Faces that had been contorted in mockery or indifference were now frozen in disbelief. Eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the simple figure standing on the stage, hands now resting quietly by her sides. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that was impossible to define. Part awe, part confusion, part raw, undeniable impact. In the rows where the mockers had gathered, a palpable shift occurred. Their smirks had vanished, replaced by an ugly, uncomfortable blankness. A flush crept up the necks of some, a sudden, frantic darting of eyes in others. Their earlier confidence, their cruel laughter, had evaporated like mist under a sudden, scorching sun. This was not the cowering failure they had anticipated. It was something else entirely, something magnificent and unexpected. And their faces, moments before smug, now betrayed a sickening wave of embarrassment. They had been so certain of her inadequacy, so ready to feast on her humiliation. Now they choked on their own assumptions, their discomfort thick enough to taste on the back of their tongues. The air around them seemed to shrink, making their earlier arrogance feel cheap and hollow. Then, a collective intake of breath, not a gasp of shock, but a slow, unified drawing in of air, as if everyone in the room, at the exact same instant, remembered how to breathe after holding it for an eternity. It was a soft, sighing sound that broke the perfect stillness, a fragile bridge between the silence and what was to come. It began as a low hum, a hesitant vibration spreading through the crowd. First, individual whispers, like tiny ripples on a calm surface. Then growing, merging into a low murmur. Heads began to turn. People leaned towards their neighbors, eyes still wide, faces still marked by the echo of astonishment. The sound was soft, hesitant, a tentative exploration of the unexpected reality that had just unfolded. It wasn't applause yet, not cheers, just the quiet, collective processing of something truly extraordinary, something that had defied every expectation, particularly those of the ones who had sought to tear her down. The whispers carried fragments of awe, fragments of confusion, and beneath it all, the undeniable tremor of respect beginning to bloom in the unexpected quiet. The air crackled with the silent aftermath, heavy and thick with the weight of witnessed impossibility. Every eye in the small, expectant crowd was fixed upon her, the very person they had so readily dismissed, so casually maligned. The masks they wore moments before, the polite indifference, the veiled contempt, the smug certainty of their own superiority, had crumbled, leaving behind raw, unguarded expressions. Some faces crumpled slightly, a tremor of something akin to shame or genuine surprise flickering in their eyes. There were individuals perhaps those who hadn't been vocal but had silently judged, whose gazes now held a look of dawning understanding, perhaps even a flicker of apology that their lips couldn't yet form. They shifted their weight uncomfortably, the crisp fabric of their expensive clothing feeling suddenly alien and cumbersome in the charged silence. Others were less yielding, their features tightening in a desperate attempt to regain the composure they had lost. A faint flush rose on a woman's neck as she subtly adjusted her pearl necklace, her eyes darting away, refusing to meet the protagonist's gaze. A man cleared his throat loudly, the sound jarring in the quiet, forcing a tight, unconvincing smile onto his lips. They shuffled their feet, smoothed non-existent wrinkles from their clothes, anything to break the spell, to deny the undeniable truth of what they had just seen. Their attempts to dismiss the event, to shrink it back into the realm of the ordinary or explain it away, were palpable, radiating a desperate energy that failed to extinguish the lingering shock. The atmosphere had undergone a profound transformation. Seconds ago, she had been an outsider, the target of their whispers and the embodiment of everything they deemed beneath them. Now, she was different. The perception shifted like a sudden change in wind direction. The space around her seemed to expand, no longer crowded by their collective judgment. The air, moments before thick with their disdain, now felt tinged with a reluctant respect, a wary curiosity, or perhaps simply an unnerved acknowledgement of power they hadn't anticipated. They saw not the underdog they had grown accustomed to, but something unknown, something capable. The faint, lingering scent of blooming jasmine in the evening air seemed to carry this new reality, a subtle sweetness mixing with the sharpness of their startled realization. Their stares, previously dismissive or critical, were now analytical, searching, perhaps even fearful. In their eyes, the reflection of the woman they thought they knew had shattered, replaced by the image of someone entirely new, someone who had just rewritten the rules of their world. The hushed murmurs of admiration still hung in the air, thick as the scent of forgotten coffee and nervous sweat. Across the common room, near the perpetually flickering overhead light, stood the two who had been the loudest in their dismissals. The young man, usually so swaggering, now fiddled with the hem of his shirt, his gaze darting anywhere but towards her. Beside him, the woman, whose laughter had once echoed with such disdain, wore a strained smile that didn't reach her eyes. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken history. Then a voice cut through the tension, not hers, but belonging to an older resident, a man who had seen many come and go within these walls. His voice was steady, laced with quiet steel.
You too. You had quite a lot to say before tonight. Found your tongue suddenly tied?
The young man flushed crimson. The woman's strained smile faltered, replaced by a look of sheer discomfort. Others around the room shifted, some nodding in agreement, others watching with a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction. This was it. The reckoning wasn't being orchestrated. It was unfolding naturally, fueled by the sheer, undeniable truth of talent witnessed. The male bully finally mumbled something barely audible. He shuffled his feet.
Look, about earlier, I guess. I mean, I didn't know. I was wrong.
His words were flat, devoid of genuine contrition, a hasty attempt to smooth over an embarrassing social gaffe, rather than an acknowledgement of the hurt caused. The female bully stepped forward, her eyes still avoiding the protagonist.
Yes, well, it was unexpected. We apologize if you were offended by our comments. We didn't mean anything by it, really.
The casual dismissal, the implication that being offended was the issue, not the offense itself. It hung in the air, a sour note in the symphony of the evening's success. It wasn't a true apology, it was damage control, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of their former dominance, or at least escape the judgmental eyes of their neighbors. But another resident spoke up, a woman whose face had been wet with tears during the performance. Her voice trembled slightly with emotion. "Savior didn't mean anything. You made her feel small, invisible. You told her she had no place here, and she just filled this whole room with beauty. You owe her more than that." A wave of agreement rippled through the onlookers. The weight of collective disapproval settled upon the two bullies. They squirmed under the gaze of the very people they had tried to influence against her. There was no grand speech from the protagonist, no triumphant declaration. She simply met their eyes, a quiet strength in her gaze that spoke volumes. She saw their discomfort, their forced smiles, their insincere words, and the genuine reproach from others. Justice, quiet and undeniable, had arrived not with a shout, but with the turning tide of public opinion, a testament to the power of resilience and the undeniable voice of talent when finally given room to sing. The air now felt lighter, cleansed by the truth. The silence that fell over the mansion after that momentous night was not merely the absence of noise, it was the hushed reverence that follows a revelation. No longer did whispers follow her down the opulent corridors, nor did the weight of disdain settle on her shoulders like a heavy shroud. The air itself felt lighter, carrying not the stale scent of secrets and resentment, but a faint, fresh aroma of possibility, like rain on dry earth. Interactions shifted fundamentally. The servants, who had once avoided her gaze or offered pitying glances, now met her eyes with a mixture of awe and a quiet, shared understanding. There was a palpable shift in the dining hall, where once she had sat alone, a solitary figure in the grand space. Now she was sometimes invited, indirectly or directly, into conversations among those she had previously only served. It wasn't immediate camaraderie, but a burgeoning respect, earned through courage rather than status. The formerly intimidating matriarch, whose sharp tongue had been a weapon, now regarded her with something akin to curiosity, perhaps even grudging admiration. The sons, who had once treated her with casual cruelty, now averted their gazes, their swagger replaced by an uneasy silence whenever she was near.
I still can't believe it. She just stood there.
The other replied. Then,
Yeah, thought she'd break. Guess we were wrong.
their voices, stripped of their usual arrogance, carried a note of stunned defeat. New opportunities quietly presented themselves. Tasks that required trust and discretion, previously assigned to others deemed more suitable, now came her way. It felt less like labor and more like contribution, a chance to use the very skills she had once hidden. The feel of new responsibilities settling into her routine was like the comforting weight of a warm blanket. This seismic shift was the undeniable power of revealing one's true self. Hiding had offered a fragile shield, but vulnerability, when met with truth, had proven to be an unbreakable armor. She walked with a different posture now, head held higher, shoulders relaxed, feeling the smooth fabric of her uniform against her skin, not as a mark of servitude, but as the attire of someone who belonged, not by birthright, but by courage. The mansion's dynamic had irrevocably changed. The shadows of past injustices still lingered in corners, but the light she had brought forth now illuminated the grand halls, promising a different kind of future within its storied walls. The weight that had pressed down on her chest for so long had finally lifted. She felt it physically, a loosening of muscles she hadn't even realized were perpetually tense. Standing taller, the air tasted sweeter, cleaner. The world, once a place of fearful glances and whispered judgments, seemed to open up before her. In the quiet aftermath, she found herself sifting through the wreckage of the past, not with pain, but with a profound sense of understanding. She learned that judgment wasn't a reflection of her worth, but a mirror held up to the insecurities and narrow views of others. Their attempts to define her had only highlighted her own strength in refusing to be confined by their small-minded boxes. The experience, though agonizing, had forged something resilient and true within her. Her voice, once hesitant and easily drowned out, now resonated with conviction. She understood that silence was complicity, and speaking her truth, no matter how terrifying, was the only path to liberation. That moment of standing firm, reclaiming her narrative, wasn't just an end to a chapter of torment. It was the beginning of her own story, written in her own hand. The lasting impact was a bedrock of confidence, an unshakable belief in her inherent value, independent of external validation or condemnation. She carried the scar, yes, but it was a reminder of a battle fought and won, a testament to the power of one's own spirit against the tide of cruelty. And so, as the dust settled and the echoes of conflict faded into the quiet hum of a life reborn, she stood on firmer ground. The moral was clear, etched into her soul. Never let the fear of what others might think silence the truth of who you are. Their judgment was a cage, built not around her, but around their own limited perspectives. Breaking free wasn't about changing their minds. It was about refusing to live within their confines. The greatest strength wasn't in fighting back with anger, but in standing tall with dignity, letting your actions and your unwavering spirit be the final word. Life, she now knew, was too precious to be lived small, hidden away from the light because others were afraid of its brilliance. The path forward was illuminated by the light she had found within, a light that no amount of external darkness could extinguish. The journey had been brutal, but the destination, finding her own voice, her own moral compass, was a victory more profound than any external validation could ever be. It was, she realized with a quiet smile, truly just the beginning.